Sometimes when we think security and countermeasures and protecting against threats, we think about firewalls, intrusion prevention systems, or DDoS mitigation techniques. But these are all on layer 4 of the OSI model, the network layer. When we're developing an application, we need to look beyond layer 4 security options and focus on the place that is most prone to risk, the application layer. What is a good way to do that? What is a good way to do that? What is a good way to take into account measures that not only secure, but optimize the capabilities of our application? What is a good way to identify countermeasures and reduce our scattered application vulnerabilities and meet security objectives? What is a good way for us to think from the perspective of a hacker and look for potential vector points to gain insight into the motivation of an attacker and the difficulty they will have to face in order to compromise their systems? And once that is done, how do we evaluate and understand our own resilience against a said attacker? All those questions can be answered through threat modeling, the mysterious software development security method that I get a lot of emails about asking, what is it? Do I have videos about it? And when and how do we use it? We will answer all those questions beginning right now. Threat modeling is suggested to be done at any point of the SDLC, but like attack surface analysis, it is best done as early as possible. And in case you wanted to make a quick CISSP cross-domain correlation with another risk management topic, threat modeling is a form of due diligence. It's a form of due diligence because you are doing your research now at great lengths to take precautions and get a full layout of this application. All due diligence is taking the time to broadly look over something and accounting for risk from a hacker's perspective, from an asset perspective, and of course, as with all things CISSP, from a complete organizational perspective. And what you do with this information in terms of controls and countermeasures is known as due care. We could have talked about threat modeling in the design phase also, but I had to make a decision for attack surface analysis as well. You can have threat modeling in the design phase, and you could have attack surface analysis in the development phase. It can be done at most stages of the SDLC. Don't convince yourself from your CISSP studies that it is locked into one specific phase. I mean, attack surface analysis and threat modeling probably won't be the best thing during the implementation phase or testing phase because there are better things to do at those times, which we'll go over, but threat modeling really works well early on. There are a few stages of the threat modeling process and a few different sources have variations, but I'll just go over what I've generally seen. We first have to draw a diagram of what all is happening in context to our software because we have to scope out our software and how the application looks in an overall layout. We have to then identify threats and possible attacks against those threats. Or should I say, from those threats. We have to then identify threats and possible attacks from those threats. We have to take into account our existing countermeasures. We then analyze our already existing vulnerabilities. Then we think of new countermeasures for both our new software and whatever existing vulnerabilities we have found. Then after we have completed our entire threat modeling process, we will verify and make sure we got everything covered as much as possible. If we were to diagram our current software requirements and design using a threat model, it would look like this. We have privilege boundaries between the users and the application, between the application and the storage server, the application and the networking devices, and the external privilege boundary that is internet facing beyond our network security devices. Privilege boundaries help us understand the different trust levels, as in where we can most trust our processes, devices, and data files. Within which boundary can we most trust our internal workings? And also where we can't untrust them. Holy cow, ladies and gentlemen, your CISSP instructor and published author of one of the top CISSP books, according to the ISC Squared, just said the words can't untrust. Can't untrust. Wow, that's the worst grammar mistake I've ever made. I apologize. Oh, my AP English teacher, Mrs. Bowman, would have a fit right about now. What I meant to say is, can't untrust. Jeez, Luke, where are you? What I meant to say is, and where we can't trust them. We're establishing privilege boundaries to see the places where we can trust or not trust our assets and application workings. For our example, since this is an application being built for internal use only, not for anyone on the internet, we have more trust privilege levels than untrusted levels. But remember, just because there are more trusted privilege levels doesn't mean we can't forget about our internal threats or social engineering. Two ways that have a greater chance of overcoming trusted privilege boundaries than any network attack, I guarantee you that. Internal threat, social engineering, they work a lot more than network attacks. Network attacks are more frequent and less successful, while internal attacks are less frequent and more successful. We also have the location of our data at rest, otherwise known as data files. The location of these is on the application and the log storage server. Then we have the application and storage as a place where multiple processes take place, not just one. There are all sorts of processes that could be happening on those two servers, more so than the user workstations. And really, the focus of this application is the software anyway, right? The focus of this threat modeling. We can't get into securing the user and security devices during this SDLC process, but we do have to consider them. We also have the markings to show our data flows, such as the request and response actions from the users to the application, from the application to the devices, and from the applications to the storage server. Okay? We now have a diagram of all our new applications' risk as part of our threat modeling process. And obviously I couldn't and didn't identify everything because then we'd be here forever. Next, we identify as many threats as we can. And we can do this using the STRIDE model. STRIDE. STRIDE is an acronym for the following: spoofing, tampering, repudiation, information disclosure, denial of service, elevation of privileges. To take full advantage of STRIDE, it is best to break down all our components and processes like we have already done in the diagram phase. Because what we're doing with STRIDE is categorizing our threats. It's a threat categorization technique. And the only way to categorize the elements in our application is to first diagram and identify them. Let's quickly run through each component in the STRIDE threat categorization list first before applying it to our diagram. But in actuality, you should already know these terms or be familiar with them anyway, since you're diligently studying for the CISSP exam. These terms are found throughout your study guide books, so all this should serve as a review. I mean, just look at what domain we are in. We're in domain 8, the very last domain. If you have read all the other domains by now, you pretty much have a good idea already of the meaning of spoofing or denial of service or elevation of privileges. Right? All right, if not, then we're just about to go through it. Spoofing means that a potential threat... real quick. In threat modeling, we are looking for threats. And where do threats come from? From threat actors. And what is a common threat actor? Hackers, malicious actors, APT attacks, insider threats, trespassers, interlopers. All of these are threat actors. Maybe even actors themselves. A power outage is not a threat actor. An earthquake is not a threat actor. A threat actor usually involves a human brain or a human hand in some way. Spoofing is when an attacker impersonates and seems like a legitimate user connection. Like someone is coming from the email address of someone in your contacts list, but you know dang well they'd never say something like they want to help you become a millionaire or something, or they have $1 million in some Libyan bank and they need to give it to you under the orders of Colonel Muammar Gaddafi. As in, the email looks like your friend's email address, but it's not really coming from them. Because you know dang well Colonel Muammar Gaddafi wants nothing to do with you. I'm sorry. I made a bet with my friend a long time ago. We're having a drinking game, and he said, I bet in your CISSP videos you can't work in the name Colonel Muammar Gaddafi. I was like, you want me to work in the name Colonel Muammar Gaddafi in my CISSP video? He's like, yeah, I bet you can't do that. I'm like, all right, I'm going to try. I'm going to work that name into my video somehow. And this was my opportunity, so I won that bet. Yeah. Colonel Muammar Gaddafi, that guy. So for Stride, we can, what are we talking about? Sorry, Gaddafi threw me all off. Oh yeah, spoofing. We're talking about spoofing. So for Stride, I'm sorry. So for Stride, we can say the security control for Okay, I'm sorry. I had to pause and laugh real hard. Okay, for spoofing, we can say the security control is authentication. Even more so, strong authentication. We want authentication to counter the threat of spoofing. Tampering means to change or modify dynamic and static data without prior authorization. Files, databases, passwords, or any type of data at rest or in storage. The security control to properly guard against tampering is integrity. To enforce integrity, integrity is the high-level concept. The technical implementation countermeasure is, of course, hashing. To understand the R in Stride, let's actually first look at the security control for it, which is non-repudiation. Non-repudiation means to have accountability and tracking controls in place wherein a sender or user can't deny that they didn't perform an operation or did. Or they did or didn't send a particular message. So in that respect, the R in Stride stands for the threat of repudiation, as in a lack of the ability to trace an action back to the original subject. Very important. The I in Stride stands for information disclosure. We all know what this is, right? It's a break in confidentiality. When a threat actor reads something they are not authorized to read. That's another way to think about it, right? Instead of just saying, oh, confidentiality is something when somebody read something they can't, think about it this way. When a threat actor reads something they are not authorized to while the data is at rest or in motion. Brute forcing the password to a file or performing a man-in-the-middle attack are some examples of information disclosure. The security control is obviously having confidentiality. And if the D in Stride stands for denial of service, the attempt to shut down an important service or system, and given that we have already mentioned our core CISSP concepts of integrity and confidentiality as controls already, what is the security control for denial of service? Availability. You got it. You see, you're already ready for the exam. What are you so worried about? You got this. And lastly, the E in Stride stands for exfiltration. Exfiltration. Just kidding. Just wanted to see if you're still paying attention. The E stands for elevation of privileges, which means that a threat has successfully obtained highly privileged rights and permissions that are given to those with more responsibilities or access to a system. At its core, the threat has gained access to data or information that has been classified to having high value. And how do we best try to reduce anyone gaining more permissions than they're supposed to have? Authorization. The security control concept of authorization. And take note that I'm calling these concepts and not a full control. These aren't actual controls, as I said before. They are the high-level concepts of the CISSP, or security in general, with which you will choose the technical controls. As in, assigning these concepts is thinking like a manager, while implementing the technical controls that uphold these concepts is thinking like someone who is technical. All right, so now let's see how we can apply the stride model to our diagram. For spoofing, a potential threat can try to spoof the account of the network engineer or the security administrator. They can also try MAC address spoofing on all of the devices and accounts, right? All machines have a MAC address. The firewall, the servers, the user workstations all have MAC addresses, and they all have the potential to be spoofed. And in the attack surface analysis, we saw that email security pertains to the network engineer and the security administrator. So we can consider email spoofing a threat too. And if we have MAC address spoofing, then of course we will also have the threat of IP address spoofing. What about for our application? Can anything be spoofed there? Definitely. An attacker, if they can compromise the new application, they can spoof a number of application processes. Or they can create a spoofed file before the real process takes place. Something that's a bit complex to explain for this video, but just remember, as a CISSP concept, this is what we're talking about when we mention time of check and time of use. Or an attacker can spoof a file name and create a file in the local directory like a library file, an executable, or a configuration file that legitimate users would access, not knowing it was actually a spoofed file or process. A whole bunch of things can be spoofed in this scenario. Even the role of network engineer or security administrator can also be spoofed. An attacker can declare themselves as the role or create a new role that can try to fool the new application into thinking it's a legitimate account. Given all those, we can say our confidentiality countermeasures could be implementing multi-factor authentication, VPN tunnels, and port address security. But of course, this is all given that the attacker compromises the user first within the local area network in the first place, or finds out local workstation information. For tampering, what did we say was a security control for it? Integrity, right? So that means tampering is where something can be changed in our diagram that would affect not only the application, but all else interconnected with it. Places where data can be changed would be the database storage server, the application, maybe even the SNMP v3 passwords used for authentication between the application and the network devices. An attacker could also modify the link to the application. Remember, the application is accessed via HTTPS, so we use a URL to gain access. An attacker can redirect to another URL. But one of the biggest threats is the modification of the code of the software itself. They can try to change the code to suit their own needs and maybe send the network administrator false alerts or highly critical alerts that aren't real alerts at all. They can also tamper with the network with the data flowing over the network. This can actually improve the previous threat of spoofing. Tampering and spoofing can go together, and sometimes they have to go together. Basically, any place where confidentiality can be a threat, integrity could most likely be a threat too. And the countermeasures we can implement for it are strong hashing algorithms, SHA-1 instead of triple DES. Proper access control as well. Best way to prevent anyone from changing anything is to stop them from touching it in the first place. Security training could also be a countermeasure since data being changed is not always malicious, but because of a user mistake. But really, this can be a countermeasure for anything, right? Security awareness is one of the best things you can do to reduce your overall risk. Security awareness and security training. There's a difference between the two. Repudiation. Where in this diagram should we be concerned with the threat of repudiation? Where do we want non-repudiation the most? It all goes back to the network engineer and security administrator roles. These roles have a significant number of privileged actions they can perform, especially the security admin. You don't want an attacker to compromise their system, or even find a flaw in the application itself in which they can anonymously change logs, remove logs, add roles, remove roles, or modify alerts. You don't want an attacker or a legitimate person to perform any action on the application without some form of non-repudiation control in place. You, as the CISSP, want to tell your developers to test code and develop code in such a manner that nothing can be done anonymously while accessing the application. And this includes the developers themselves. They shouldn't be adding backdoors or accounts of their own to access the application while in production. At an extent, as a countermeasure, you can implement digital signatures or some form of private key signing. But I'll tell you, this is a complex process, and most managers will not incorporate non-repudiation measures at this stage of the development of the software. But that's why we're doing attack surface analysis and threat modeling. We want to still keep on identifying threats and vulnerabilities, even if we don't do anything about it right now. At least we have identified it and just thought of some countermeasures. If digital signatures won't work or aren't viable for your organization, what's the next best thing? Just plain logs. Just have logging, which provides accountability. For information disclosure, it kind of just goes back to what we were talking about for confidentiality and integrity. As in, don't store passwords in clear text on any of the servers or workstations. Use encryption and hashing formulas. A threat to be considered about what would also be to provide, a threat to be considered would also be to provide enhanced server and browser security, along with continuous security updates and patches for the application, to mitigate the threat of vulnerabilities that can enable keyboard logging or install scripts that can capture your screen or track mouse movements. You do not want that. That's like my worst nightmare. For denial of service, especially in the SDLC process and throughout your CISSP studies and almost any other CISSP instructor's content, the best way to stop denial of service is to start with the very code being written. Any good CISSP instructor will tell you that. That's really what a denial of service is. You hear about DOS or DDoS on corporate networks or devices, but what exactly is happening at its core? Things like the amount of memory or buffer space is what's being manipulated. Proper coding can resolve or at least reduce the risk of denial of service if the code or memory is the exploit factor. Denial of service attacks include TCP SYN floods, amplification attacks, zero-day DDoS, or application-level DDoS. Big threats. The best denial of service countermeasure is not expensive DDoS mitigation vendors or expensive load balancers and content delivery networks or traffic throttling or DDoS, counter DDoS specialists, but simply to have strong code reviews and coding principles. To simply do what we're doing right now, threat modeling. Pretty neat, huh? Alright, and for elevation of privileges, we know the threat may attack the users and the application in order to be able to get more privileges. As in, someone may compromise a network engineer's workstation and then try to laterally move and get access to the security administrator's role in order to escalate their privileges to remove or add new accounts. The countermeasure to this? You got it. Run processes and accounts with least privilege and strong access control. Other technical measures may include firewalls, sandboxes, and your usual network security devices that you already know about. Okay, Stride. Pretty easy process once you get a good idea about it. It's nothing complicated. It's just another process to learn for the CISSP exam. The exam is it's a process-oriented exam. And if you don't know the process, how will you ever know how to fix it? For our Stride threat modeling model, we have listed some of the threats and their countermeasures. But you don't have to do this completely all the time. You can break it down into different categories like non-mitigated threats, partially mitigated threats, or fully mitigated threats. Like what I said earlier, there's some threats that we might fix, might not fix. It doesn't matter as long as we have identified it. There isn't a rule that everything has to be done now, and it shouldn't be done now because things are, of course, going to change down the line that may eliminate everything we've listed here right now. It reminds me of some military term they said, like some military term that says, no plan survives first contact with the enemy. I think I'm saying that right. I don't know. I'm not a military guy. No plan survives first contact with the enemy. I'm pretty sure that's right. That makes sense, right? You can plan all you want, but as soon as you make contact with the enemy, nothing really goes as planned. It's February 16th, 2022, and if you know what's happening in the news right now, you know exactly what I'm talking about. Ridiculous. All right. We have completed considering security in the development phase of the software development lifecycle by performing threat modeling. Let's now move on to the testing phase.